Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Reading Interculture podcast. It's just me today, unfortunately, because I was feeling a little bit under the weather, but still me, so it's still pretty cool, still pretty cool. Today I'm here with Liam Isaac, the author of the wonderful piece Disaster Mob. How are you today, Liam?
I'm doing good. Thanks for having me.
No, thanks so much for being here. Really appreciate it. Really appreciate it. So Liam, who are you? What do you do? Like, what are you doing here? Why should people? What are you doing here? Generally, existentially,
Um,
personally.
I'm Liam. I'm a writer. I live in
Hmm.
Queens, New York. I write fiction and nonfiction and comics and prose, and I also do tabletop RPG design and occasionally freelance writing for a couple of art centers and museums.
Oh, very cool. That's really cool. That's like it's wonderful doing this magazine. You get so many different kind of career backgrounds, so many people with so many different paths into writing, and kind of comic books is a kind of thing that I've not really seen it kind of from this kind of perspective in the magazine yet. So it's really cool to kind of like writing is such a broad thing that can take so many forms, and it's really fun to kind of see that manifested. I really enjoy that. Um,
Yeah, I'm happy to represent the comics world. That's fun.
totally. How did you like get into writing? What's your kind of what made you want to be a writer?
Yeah, I grew up um, like in a very artistic household.
Hmm.
Like my dad went to school for music, and my mom is a writer and an artist. And I kind of like before I even knew that uh, I guess I kind of always knew you could do writing as a career because my mom was doing it. But
Hmm.
like before I even had like an understanding of like what I wanted to do, like I was telling stories. I played a lot of like D&D, tabletop role
Yeah.
playing games, stuff like that,
Hmm.
and I read a lot of comic books, and I read more comic books than I did novels because
Yeah.
I had like a learning disability growing up, and
Hmm.
comic books were kind of a way to introduce myself to literature.
Hmm.
Um, and then uh, coming into college, I went to school for literature, and I was like, I'm going to study literature. Um, and I wasn't even really thinking about comics at all. Um,
Hmm.
I took a class called Reading and Writing. It was called Historical Fiction slash Fictional Histories, and it was about historical fiction. And
Hmm.
it like really, I read like Roberto Bolaño for the first time,
Mm.
and
That's great.
Sebald, and a lot of like Latin American and European
Yeah.
authors that kind of made me like think about literature like more seriously, like prose. Um, and I was like, that was like my freshman year, my sophomore year, or I think the first term of my sophomore year. And I was like, okay, I'm gonna do literature, like I'm gonna be a novelist. And
Hmm.
then my junior year, I took a class with an incredible poet and essayist called An Duplan, um, about that was like a nonfiction class, like nonfiction
Hmm.
essays, and it totally like shifted. And I was like, okay, actually, I'm going to be an essayist. I'm going to write nonfiction, and I kind of like abandoned fiction. I was like, okay, I'm not doing this anymore. I'm just going to write
Yes.
about comics and write about
Yes.
literature. Um, and I started a project about that I'm still working on. That's a collection of essays about comic books and about the
Mm.
industry and my thoughts on the industry and my relationship to comics. Um, and this story kind of came out of that. It wasn't
Hmm.
part of the project, but it was on my mind. And my senior year, I took like, a bunch of fiction classes because I was like,
Hmm.
actually, I missed this thing bouncing
Yeah.
around. I guess I can do both. Um,
It's true.
and so yeah. uh, so this was one of the stories that I wrote kind of in the tail end of my college days, and then
Mm.
I worked on a bunch of the last. I graduated 2 years ago, and I working on this story and a couple other stories for the last 2 years, uh, and yeah,
Yeah.
and those last 2 years I've been kind of focusing on fiction again.
Mm.
Still working on this like larger nonfiction project about comics, but yeah, I've had a lot of fun writing comic book scripts, which I haven't done since high school, and writing. short stories.
Amazing. That's very interesting. I think that's such a wonderful part of being an undergraduate is kind of whatever kind of class you're taking at the moment is always the most interesting thing and the thing that you're totally passionate about. And then next semester, one semester, I'm definitely going to be an essay writer because you're doing an essay writing class. And the next semester, I'm definitely going to be a poet because you're doing a poetry writing class. And at the end of it, you
Exactly. Yeah.
should have a nice overview. It's always very fun, you know. Or like I totally like Derrida. It's all about Derrida. I love deconstruction. And I know it's all about, you know, and so on. It's great like that. I don't know. Okay, amazing. What kind of comics? What kind of comics do you like? What's your kind of comic? I don't know. I don't know. What comics do you like? Simple question.
Well, I grew up reading like a lot of superhero stuff, like colloquially, you know, I call it cape shit. That's what people on the internet call it
Yeah.
too.
Okay. Yeah.
Kind of derogatory term for superhero stuff. um, but as I've gotten older, and this is kind of a lot of what my nonfiction work is about in regards to comics is about the kind of problematic nature of superheroes and like
Yeah.
the kind of vigilante cop like structure that they're protecting the status quo, and they're not, you know, that's what they're fighting for. They're united under a common good that is usually like aliens invading, that has nothing really to do with the ailments of our current, you know, moment in history. Um, and so I've been really interested in kind of the interrogations of that, of comics that are like Watchmen is a really big example of this, that also really informed how 90s comics came to be, which is a little bit of what my story is about too. But I'm not like a big Watchmen guy. I think it's kind of overrated. And I'm more because it's very cynical. And I'm kind of lately I've kind of been interested in the kind of like the kind of hope core angle of
I understand.
superheroes.
Yeah.
And like maybe superheroes can be cool and can be good if they're actually fighting, you know, against the status quo, if they're fighting for people. And there's been a lot of that's kind of like a sentiment right now in like the industry. There are a lot of books that are from that perspective, and I think it's interesting. There's a great book happening right now called Power Fantasy, by Kieran Gillen and Casper Weingart, and that's a lot about that. And even in the industry, the big two, the Marvel and DC, like the two most popular runs in the last year were the Absolute runs, which are like the inverse. Like you have Bruce Wayne as he's like not a millionaire. He's just like a dude, and he's fighting for the people. And then the Ultimates in Marvel, there's like a supervillain who systematically alters the past so that all of the heroes are nobody, and then they have to find themselves. And he controls the world, and so they have to like fight the world. And there's all this kind of interesting stuff happening. And so there's this element. There's this side of my comic book brain where like, oh, I'm grappling with this thing that's problematic, and I'm interested in it, and so I'm reading still superheroes and stuff. But also, as I've gotten older, I love the kind of independent underground stuff. Art Spiegelman, Mouse, you know, his work, and a lot of the underground work that he did with like people like Joe Sacco, who wrote, who's like a journalist, comic book writer who did a lot of work about Palestine and Gaza, and like even some of the weirder people like Robert Crumb, who is also kind of has a problematic history, but is fascinating nonetheless. Spain Rodriguez, who was writing in the 60s and the 70s about like he had a very famous comic called Trash Man, which I really feel is like ahead of its time, like critiquing superheroes for what they are. And yeah, I love all sorts of stuff.
Yeah, no, that's very interesting. No,
I'm
of course.
trailing off. I'm here.
No. I think that's very good. That's very good. Very interesting to hear. Yeah, because I guess my like relationship with comic books is I like was quite into it when I was like 14, 15, and quite into like, yeah, I've had Watchmen and like
Yeah.
Frank Miller stuff and quite a lot of Alan Moore stuff. But like I never
Yeah.
really got, and then eventually I kind of stopped it. I never got like really, really into it. So but I've had like a few, like, I don't know, like kind of the more famous Batman comics I know, like Long Halloween or Killing Joke, but like
Yeah.
I haven't read that much, especially not kind of more modern stuff. So it's very interesting to me to kind of researching this episode to kind of get back in touch with that interest of mine and kind of, I don't know, it's very interesting. I don't know. So I thank you for kind of making me think about comic
Oh
books again.
yeah.
I really appreciate that.
Yeah. Yeah.
uh,
That's awesome. Yeah, you bring up some great stuff. Like
mm,
a lot of that it's Alan Moore, and Alan Moore is like he's definitely a genius, I think. But he's also he's got his own issues writing
yeah,
these books, I think, too. That is
yeah,
worth like talking about. I think
totally.
people who are suspect of the superhero genre for good reason often
Mm,
hail Alan Moore as like, oh, the antidote to that, and really thinking about what superheroes really are. But I think also they give him too much credit, and I think that he's just as uh, guilty of
mm,
running into these tropes that anybody else is.
yeah, I can imagine that. Okay, then
Yeah,
I think it's probably a good time to start reading the piece, I think. So if you
yeah,
wouldn't
sure.
mind, if you wouldn't mind, Liam.
Yeah. Um, Disaster Mob. The following is a rejected draft of the afterword for Terence Fellow's Disaster Mob, 30th Anniversary Edition, published by Detonation Comics, a subsidiary of Ube Iwerks Media. The original Disaster Mob was published by Detonation Comics in 1996, and its 30th Anniversary Edition is set to release later this year. The draft in question is by Disaster Mob co-creator and lead artist David Turetsky. To be quite frank, I find it absurdly difficult to write this sort of thing. I know that's rather cliche to say about a collection of one's own work, but it's true, and perhaps for not for the reasons you'd expect. When Disaster Mob editor extraordinaire Samantha Keith asked me to fill up a couple of pages to introduce myself as co-creator of this treasured series, I was more than hesitant. Her email sat in my inbox for weeks until I had the courage to respond. That is because, unfortunately, I have never felt entirely like the co-creator of the treasure series in question. And on top of my imposterous attitude toward this work, it had barely been a year since my former friend and colleague, Terence Fellow, who wrote the issues in this lovely hardcover collection you see before you, passed away. Terence and I met at a comics convention on a cold October morning in 1995. This was still during a time when Comic-Cons were actually for comics and not a place for adult children to ogle at corporate advertising on a weekday and buy ridiculous bobbleheads of their favorite superheroes, whose creators, by the way, never get a cent of the revenue those plastic pieces of shit make. Our booths happened to be across from each other at the rinky-dink venue we'd flown out to in Maine. At that time, I was finishing up some ink work for a DC project that sold rather lacklusterly. I had pinned up prints of my most memorable pages and displayed some of my original art on my table beside my name. I knew of Terence, having read a few issues of his run on Uncanny Lightman, but he seemed elusive, having come out of nowhere to do some work for the Big Two and quickly skyrocketing himself to fame and fortune. Not that anyone could actually make a real fortune in this line of work. He was one of those McFarlane types who'd always been around, but you never realized how much of a star he was until it was too late. I'd heard a rumor that same year that Jim Shooter, editor-in-chief at Marvel, was his cousin or some such, but in any event, he rose to comics greatness with apparent ease, and this first interaction with him was at the height of his commercial success. There were also rumors he was planning to end his 5-year contract with Marvel and start a book at this new independent publishing house, Detonation Comics, which was making headlines for its unusually fair treatment of creators. This line of work pays like shit, a fact I'm sure my contemporaries reading this know all too well. It sounded wonderful to be part of something like that, but I was an up-and-coming artist, still barely breaking into the industry. I had no pull, no cousins that were editor-in-chief at Marvel. No one had come to my table except for one teenager who seemed to think I was Dave Cockrum, But I didn't have the heart to tell her otherwise. I waited for hours, watching fans walk by, dressed as Spider-Man and Batman, and occasionally Swamp Thing. No one dresses up as Swamp Thing, and I thought that was pretty neat. This was how it went at that time in my life. I was very accustomed to the tedious convention grind. But having been placed across from comic superstar Terrence Fellows, I was a little peeved, and on that day in particular, packing it all up for good crossed my mind more than once. I watched as lines and lines of fans waited to have their issues of Lightman signed. At noon, I began to gather my things to take my lunch break when Terrence left his assistant at his booth and walked across the aisle toward me. I couldn't believe it. I sat right back down, making eye contact with him. His sharp smile with those Midwesternly crooked teeth pinned me to my chair. He said something like, "Hi, I'm Terrence Fellows," and I said something like, "Yes, I know who you are. The pleasure is mine. Would you like to look at my work?" "Of course I would," yada yada, etc., etc. He thumbed through my pencils, then happened across a sketch I had done earlier that day. It was a spider ape hybrid creature, toting a hyperbolically large rifle, a bandolier around his chest, and a beret upon his little monkey head. Terrence asked who he was, and I told him it was an original character, and I hadn't come up with a name yet. "Really? No name?" he asked. I stammered. "How about Glitch?" "Love it. I really dig this guy. What's his deal?" "A soldier, I think, for a fascist dictatorship or something." "Hell yeah, man. I want to write a comic for this guy." He said it so nonchalantly. Terrence always had this casual air to him, like everything was really no big deal at all. That same day, Terrence asked me to draw a few more designs for characters like Glitch, sketches that would later become Red Diamond, Hawk, Golden Sage, and Featherfall, the fan favorite characters you see here in this lovely hardcover collection before you. He told me, "Let's see what else you can come up with by the end of the day, and we can hash out the details later." He gave me his hotel room number, and the next day at breakfast, we hashed it out. Of course, as you already know, Glitch and his friends would become the members of a ragtag group of monsters, science experiments turned soldiers that went AWOL at the end of the Vietnam War, and thus our baby, Disaster Mob, was born. Later that same October, we pitched the idea to Detonation Comics, and I got to drawing the first issue's cover. Had I not drawn Glitch that day, had I gotten up earlier for my lunch break, had we been placed at different corners of the venue, my life would have never changed, and I might never have broken into comics. But then again, even after the success of Disaster Mob, my life didn't change all that much compared to my co-creator. The first chapter's script was an exhaustive 74 pages of tiresome exposition for an issue that was supposed to be 22 pages long. He called me frantically as I was getting into bed one night and asked me to cut down the script and illustrate the first few pages by the next day. This was before the impeccable Samantha Keith joined us as editor. I told him I'd do my best, as I was just as excited as he was, but this became a frustrating pattern. Many of the first 20 issues of the series were delivered to me like this, unedited, messy, and way too long. The ones that weren't a laughable jumble of words came to me in panicky 2-sentence letters. He wrote to me once, "Didn't have the time to write anything this week. How about the mob meets aliens? Just go crazy. Do whatever you want." The issue later became Monkeys in Space, which I'm quite proud of. Finally, Samantha joined us, and things got a bit easier, but I was still doing a lot of the heavy lifting on the storytelling side. Occasionally, I'd get a script that was a paragraph long, and I'd had to write the dialogue, which critics would note was never my strong suit. But, in all honesty, I was just happy to have a job, and one that was as successful as it was. Disaster Mob was not the most commercially successful of Terrence's work. Anything he wrote for the Big Two far outsold the majority of his indie masterpieces, but it was by far the most critically successful. It was praised for its edgy, political take on what superheroes would actually be like in our real world, although in hindsight that's what everyone was trying to do at the time. And in fact, we had the occasional critic tell us we had gone too far, particularly with our takes on the Waco siege and the Kent State massacre, or that our book was a Watchmen ripoff. After our grand finale in 1999, I saw Terrence for the first time at a wrap party of sorts at his new home in Los Angeles. We clinked champagne glasses, and he told me he wanted to do something big with Disaster Mob moving forward, but he wouldn't tell me what. I told him it sounded exciting, and I was on board, but I needed a break, at least for a month or two. Unbeknownst to me, iWorks Media was about to buy our little indie publisher, seeing as Detonation Comics was going bankrupt. In the wake of this, Terrence was asked to expand the Disaster Mob universe and began writing multiple new spin-off stories. I found out months afterwards when my agent sent me a solicitation for Disaster Mob Echoes, featuring art by Rob fucking Liefeld. New leadership wanted better artists, assholes that were big during that era like J. Scott Campbell, Eric Larson, Mark Silvestri. Excerpts of their work on the series can also be found in this lovely hardcover collection. Terrence never reached out to me and ghosted me on several occasions after I, in my naivete, pleaded with Detonation to have a meeting with him. Terrence later sat at a panel at San Diego Comic-Con that he, in fact, had created Glitch, Red Diamond, Hawk, Golden Sage, and Featherfall. This was the final nail in the coffin, so to speak. I thought about suing, but I knew I wouldn't win a dime. It was iWorks, and their legal team would crush me like Mr. Metal, Glitch's infamous arch-nemesis. Moreover, Disaster Mob was work for hire, and what had happened to me was happening to everyone else. None of us really owned the rights to our characters. Years later, Disaster Mob was given the major motion picture treatment, as many of Terrence's later works were. I remember sitting in the theater with my wife in 2005, watching the credits roll in that mediocre feature, a butchering of the work I had done. At the time, it had been compared to Blade and X-Men, but ultimately fell short of what made the original great. My goddamn art. My goddamn direction. And there, at the end, special thanks to creator of Disaster Mob, Terrence Fellow. There his name was, in the credits, and me, in the theater, sipping my Diet Coke, having not spoken to Terrence in years. I was still living in upstate New York in the same house I lived in when drawing Disaster Mob, and he was in Los Angeles, working with Jon Favreau on a live-action, iWorks-funded Lightman movie. After seeing the dumpster fire that was Disaster Mob, I thought about throwing out my original sketches of Glitch and his friends, which had been framed in my studio since I returned from that fateful Maine Comic-Con trip. Instead, I sold them online and bought a new car, vowing to never think about Terrence or all the ways he screwed me over. Until, I suppose, now. This lovely hardcover collection is indeed lovely. It harkens back to a simpler time. I do hope you've enjoyed reading it just as much as I enjoyed creating Disaster Mob. David Turetsky, 2026. Dear David, I appreciate the work you've done for this afterword, but I don't think we can publish something like this. Our omnibus is a love letter to Terrence and his work, and as you know, it's coming out on the anniversary of his fucking death. We can't put something this degrading and libelous in a book that millions of fans will read. The socials will lose it. And my boss can't take another scandal after the whole not paying artists as much as our writers thing. I'll give you another shot, but if you can't deliver, I'm reaching out to Liefeld. All the best. Samantha Keith.
Amazing. Thank you very much. So wonderfully read. So I think maybe a good place to start is with the form. So it's kind of a piece with kind of three texts in a way. There's kind of a kind of summary, and then there's the forward, and then there's I suppose an email response to the forward. And my question would be why the decision to tell this story in this way? This story could be told in so many ways, and why do it kind of with a forward is I guess my question. And then why have a commentary to that forward in the email? What does that kind of say? What's the interaction there?
Yeah, so the idea started, I was taking a class in college, my last year, called Perfect Vacuums. And it was a class about texts within texts in fictional texts. So like you have a novel and the novel is talking about a novel that does not exist, and maybe excerpts of the novel are within it. And the name of the course comes from Stanislaw Lem, I think. Wait, I had pulled it up here so I could know what I was talking about. So it's been a while since I was in college.
Take your time, boys.
Yeah, Stanislaw Lem, A Perfect Vacuum, which is a book, a collection of reviews of books that don't exist. And so I was reading that. I was reading books like Pale Fire by Nabokov, Possession by A.S. Byatt, The Blind Assassin by Margaret Atwood. Um, uh, we read some Borges. We read some Bolaño. Um, and I was also at the same time I was taking a workshop class on fiction,
Mm-hmm.
and so I can't remember if this story originally came out of a exercise we did for that class, but it eventually ended up. Um, I wrote it specifically for this workshop class, and
Mm-hmm.
that was my assignment for the workshop class. And so I was thinking about books. I was thinking about like this idea of like you know, originally the idea is thinking about a text about a book that does not exist.
Yeah.
And then like I'm thinking about comics all the time, so this kind of comes to me, um, and that's how the kind of structure came to be. And I remember at the time I was reading Grant Morrison's Doom Patrol, which
Mm-hmm.
is uh, you know, Disaster Mob is I think to any reader of Doom Patrol is very clearly a ripoff of Doom Patrol. Um, and you know you have your big monkey character, you've got your crazy scientists,
Mm-hmm.
and it's also like there are a lot of these types of ragtag group of crazy people
Mm-hmm.
that are being written about in the 90s. Um, yeah, and I was reading that, and I read uh, the afterword for that, and Grant Morrison is talking about writing Disaster Mob and like how he got on the project, or they got on the project, sorry, and how the artist came, how I think there were a couple different artists working on that and how they were working, and I felt like, oh, this is such a sanitized version of like
Mm-hmm.
what probably happened, like how that they're not getting paid at all. Doom Patrol, in my mind, is like synonymous with Grant Morrison. Grant Morrison doesn't own any of these characters, and I was like, what? Wouldn't it be fun if I just did this, but it was like spiteful Grant
Yeah.
Morrison who was really angry and frustrated with how the industry was, and took off the mask for a second, and that's kind of yeah.
Yeah. That's very interesting. I think that's very interesting. I think having it be a forward really kind of says something about ownership. Very interestingly, the kind of write forward to a text to somehow is to have a kind of some kind of editorial control, and even that is denied. David is kind of I think it's a very striking choice. I think it really is effective. And I think that brings it quite interestingly to kind of I guess the 90s comic book scene industry. Because I think that's maybe one of the striking pieces things about the piece is kind of the 90s is a time where before the 90s comic book writers and artists were kind of absurdly exploited and didn't own any of their characters and got paid very little. And then in the 90s you have a kind of push for the writers to own like creations and all of this, and you get like Image Comics and various smaller publishers to kind of to compete with the big two. But then
Mm-hmm.
this piece is kind of shows that maybe that isn't all it's cracked out to be. That it is kind of that. Sure, people like Terrence Fellows got a pretty good deal, but people like David Turetsky did not. You know, that like I'm sure, yeah, like it was great for Todd McFarlane. It was, but it wasn't really. There was a kind of just a kind of upper class of the industry that kind of maybe didn't trickle down. Seems to be maybe something that the piece is commenting on. So there's a kind of interesting. The piece is set in a time where creator ownership was such a controversial topic, and it kind of questions the legitimacy of Terrence Fellows owning his characters in a kind of other way than you would expect. I don't know if that makes sense. What I'm kind of going at there.
Totally. No, yeah,
Mm.
that is a great like a way to describe what was happening in the 90s. Um,
Mm.
yeah, I mean, I was born in 2002, so
Mm.
I'd never like that's not the world of comics that I
Yeah.
that I
Hmm.
lived through, but it's something that I'm super fascinated by,
Hmm.
because I'm interested in ownership and corporate ownership of these characters, that make so much money. In
Hmm.
like you look at the highest grossing films of all time, and it's like Avengers,
Yeah.
Spider Man. Yeah, it's Avengers and Spider Man, and
Hmm.
the people that have drawn those characters for years, have not gotten a cent from any of those movies, and they make billions of dollars. And
Yeah.
I'm not the first to say how ridiculous that is. People talk about it all the time, but it really starts in the '90s because Marvel was going bankrupt. A lot of the companies were going bankrupt, and Paramount and Disney came in and pulled them up, and it was also happening at the same time that like there was this push with Image Comics and other independent publishers to 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 try to make amends, I think. But also the stories were very one note. That's something that a lot of people don't talk about. Like a lot of these books are not Watchmen, and
Yeah.
they are kind of like conservative and
Yeah.
yeah, difficult to come to terms with.
No, that's
So
something I also
so yeah,
sorry, go
I'm
on.
interested in the '90s. Yeah, no,
That's
go on.
something I wanted to get to is like so yeah, like in the 90s, for lack of a better term, comics got edgy. They got kind of
Yeah,
and they kind of became maybe more kind of focused at maybe an older audience, or an audience that wanted to feel older at least. And I feel like at the time maybe that felt quite subversive and felt quite fresh. But looking back on it, it does feel, as you said, very conservative or even fascistic at some points. Like if you read some Frank Miller, Frank Miller especially is an avowed fascist man. But there's a
yeah,
kind of this kind of edginess in our political context now. Edginess is a kind of perspective that is somehow right wing. It's somehow right wing to be edgy in our current political climate. It
yeah.
feels like, and maybe that wasn't the case in the 90s. And so I guess that kind of interaction with that is, I think, something really interesting about this piece. And there's kind of the character design of the 90s is kind of infamous in that all the characters have like 4 guns and 10 scars, and it's kind of,
Yeah.
I don't know. So that's really interesting too. It's kind of, I don't know.
Yeah, there's that famous Rob Liefeld
Yes, yes.
image of Captain America with the giant chest. Yeah, and it's everything's super exaggerated
Mm.
and yeah, and people thought that was awesome, and
Yeah.
I struggle with that. Yeah,
No, totally, totally. So I guess that's kind of part of it. Is a kind of, I don't know. It's a take on the superhero genre that is different from the kind of beforehand, but is not like, what is it? I don't know. It's kind of interesting, right? That to view Batman as a kind of fascistic vigilante force, is that what? How is that? How does that respond to Batman as a kind of childhood, man in tights fighting a clown? Like, what is that progression in the industry say? And it kind of Disaster Temple feels like very clearly a 90s edgy 90s comic. So like, what is the kind of, how do you feel about these comics? I guess, sorry, I'm not really finding my question here, but like
no,
you
no,
said, you're
no.
critical of
That's
the
a
superhero, trope. These comics are also critical of that trope. What do you think about the way in which they're critical of that trope? Is my question at the end of the day.
yeah, yeah, um, yeah. That's a great question. I think the '90s is the birth of the antihero and how
Mm-hmm.
we understand it today, which is such a prevailing archetype in media, like
Mm.
regardless of um, yeah, regardless of whether or not it's a superhero. I think we see this in like like current war movies, like post 9/11 war movies. Your protagonist is like, this guy who's done some bad shit, but needs to do some bad shit to
Mm.
stop these terrorists and
Yeah,
preserve freedom. And it's like it's like manufacturing consent for like, oh, our good guys need to also be kind of bad guys because we're
yeah.
fighting a different type of war now. And I think perhaps the antihero in the '90s was kind of like you're saying, was more of a subversive thing,
Mm.
and it got co-opted. I'm not sure if I'd have to think about that more. I haven't actually thought about
Mm.
it like that. Um, but I also want to say that maybe it was conservative from the get go. But
Yeah,
I don't
no.
want to.
Mm,
I'm interested in what you're saying. Like it does initially have like a subversive element to it. I think that's probably true, um, to a degree.
yeah,
Um, but yeah, but I think like it ultimately gets co opted by um, bad actors
mm,
post 9/11, like in the early
yeah,
2000s, as this, like the Punisher is like a prime
yeah,
example of this, and has been totally co-opted by um, cops in the U.S. as like
yeah, yeah,
uh, this figure of like has done some bad shit, but needs to do some bad shit to protect our streets, which
yeah,
is such a just falsity, falsehood. And also like a complete misunderstanding, I think, of a character like the Punisher, who is inherently a bad guy, but
yeah,
McFarlane and Liefeld make him seem really cool.
yeah.
Or people like that.
Yeah, I guess that's my other question is how do you imagine Turetsky as an artist? Because you say like he, so you mentioned a number of artists there who are kind of, yeah, as you said, very famous or infamous for their kind of inexplicable proportions of huge muscles and kind of maybe lacking a certain technical quality, but enjoying a kind of over the topness. And how do you imagine Turetsky in response to that? What kind of is he in a Liefeld mold? Is he also drawing really exaggerated muscular characters, or is he somehow different to that?
I think um, I think Turetsky is a character that's interesting because I think that he's a little bit full of himself,
Mm.
um, and I try to read it with that kind of tone,
Yes.
even
Yes.
though I think that he's justified in his anger.
Mm-hmm.
And so I do think like, is he? I think there are two kind of, yeah, maybe he is like a Liefeld person, even though he has clearly a lot of contempt for Liefeld.
Mm-hmm.
But I also maybe would like to imagine him as kind of a Bill Sienkiewicz, like a little bit more experimental, kind
Mm-hmm.
of weird, but still like comfortable in the umbrella of the '90s
Yeah.
look.
Mm-hmm.
Um, yeah. Do you know Bill Sienkiewicz?
Oh, I
Have
don't know
you
him.
seen his work?
Not seen any of his work. I'll have to have a look.
It's hard to describe, but it's like really like
Let me have a look.
um,
Um,
it's like scratchy, and there's an exaggeration, but there's also like I guess abstraction of the like caricature esque, I guess, less so than Liefeld.
yeah, it's an interesting answer. Okay, yeah, I think that's interesting. Like David is such an interesting character because he's such a kind of he seems like kind of like an asshole, you know, kind of like a cynical,
Yeah,
bitter person, you know, like his description of
yeah,
Comic Cons is a bit, you know, and it's funny, but like I totally understand, and I think that works, you know. He's like an interesting, it puts him in an interesting perspective, and I guess that's something else I want to discuss. Like Samantha is another character who kind of hangs over the piece, and then we kind of hear a
hmm
speak at the end. I'm like, what? How do you imagine? But what's kind of Samantha's role? Is because on the one hand, maybe she's like a moderating figure, like a kind of that maybe challenge David's perspective in the reader's mind, or maybe Samantha is there to kind of be more of a kind of establishment, competent but establishment person, or some kind of I don't know, like what is how can we understand Samantha?
yeah. That's a great question. Um, I want to say it just came to me about David Turetsky. The name I just because this is going to be out there, like this is the name of my veterinarian. So I wanted like I took this name because I felt like this is just like a disclaimer.
It's a good
Anyways, on
name.
to Samantha. Yeah, I just let it say David Turetsky. Great name, sounds like the name of a comic book artist
It does, it
for
does.
sure.
No, it works
Um,
really well.
anyways, on to Samantha. Yeah, I think
Mhm.
that she is. I think that she's um, I don't think that she is like a voice of the establishment because
Mm.
when it comes down to it, again, this is still comics, and she's
Yeah,
still an editor, and she's
yeah,
like an editor of this um, lowbrow, quote unquote, artistic industry.
Mhm.
And so I don't think she's getting paid that much either.
Yeah.
And I think she kind of has maybe a more of a level-headed view than either Terrence or um, uh, um, David have.
Mm.
Um, and not to say that she's like a centrist, but I think that she's like just kind of like a um, pragmatic and like this
Yeah.
is a job and these are two eccentric artists that I have
Mm.
to like wrangle together and I have to tell I had to when Terrence was alive I had to tell Terrence give some actual full scripts so that your artist can do his job and I have to tell David now like don't write something that's crazy about your dead partner your dead
Yeah.
creative partner um, and I think I have a lot of sympathy for her because I think that she like everybody in this industry who is actually working on these books, they're just trying to do their job and they're just
Yeah.
trying to tell a story. And and I think the editors um, at these companies and for these books are unsung heroes in a lot of ways. Much like
Mm.
that, the industry is really interesting because it's so split up in
Mm.
it's such a collaborative medium because you have the writer and the artist working together on most books. Sometimes you have like an author who's doing both. You have the writer and the artist, and then you have the colorist, the inker, the letterer, and the editor, and all of these people are making the book what it is. And um, on that note, perhaps the most unrealistic thing about this story is that Terrence is like working with Jon Favreau. The writers are also not getting shit, but they are
Yeah.
the top billed people, and they are when you talk about Watchmen, it's Alan Moore's Watchmen.
Yeah. Yeah. Totally.
When you talk about V for Vendetta, it's Alan Moore's V for Vendetta,
Mm.
and these artists are just sidelined, and a lot of people that don't know the names of these artists.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, and I think that's also what David is getting at and what I'm getting at in my own bitterness about the medium and the
Yeah.
industry. But yeah, I think Samantha holds a really important um, role in that she's the pragmatist. She's the realistic one.
Mm.
She's not filled with this ego that these two
Yeah.
other artists are working with. Yeah,
Yeah. I think that comes across really well. I think Samantha. I think that's kind of maybe one of the things the piece is saying is that comic books, but artistic creation generally is collaborative, and you can't credit shouldn't be assigned like that. And it's not simply the point. The piece very simply doesn't make the simple piece, which is artists should have more credit and not just writers, because Samantha is there to kind of challenge that too. And when David says my was it my direction, my vision, it's that's kind of it doesn't
yeah,
seem to be all that true. It seemed like a lot of it was Samantha's vision, you know. So it's a kind of
yeah,
the inclusion of Samantha makes it a more nuanced piece where it's about like this is a whole ecosystem that allows this book to exist, and all these people deserve recognition, you know. And I think that's kind of a very kind of very touching point.
yeah. And she says in her last bit like it almost in the same breath. She's like, yeah, there's this whole scandal in the industry about
Yeah,
how
yeah,
this is in reference to like I think 2 or 3 years ago. Um, I think it was Bleeding Cool reported that, and again, I'm getting my facts wrong probably, but it's either DC or Marvel, and there was a big controversy. They're like, oh yeah, writers are getting paid like X amount
yeah,
more than artists, which is crazy because arguably artists are doing the harder job. Um,
yeah,
and as somebody who's written comic book scripts, I can attest to that. Like this shit is easy compared not to say that it's easy, but like
yeah,
it's
yeah. No, I
it's
understand.
way less time consuming
Yeah,
than than a page of a comic book takes like a day to make, and if the standard is 22 pages, that's a month that an
yeah,
artist's doing for each book, and then the next month they got to go and do the next book. and yeah, it's crazy, and they get paid like nothing.
Yeah.
So, anyways, in that same breath, she's saying, you know, there's this whole scandal, but also if you can't cut it, I am going to reach out to Liefeld. I am going to, you know,
Yeah.
prop up
Yeah.
this establishment name figure.
Totally.
Yeah.
No, totally. I think that really works as a kind of the kind of the realism of it. I think is really you really get a sense of what Samantha's like as a person. I really enjoy it. Um, I guess that's kind of brings me to my next question, which is I think to a lot of people who are kind of more familiar with literature as a kind of written writing without pictures is a
Mhm.
kind of the idea that writers wouldn't own their work is quite shocking. We wouldn't. It kind of. I don't even think about the fact that novelists they own their characters and they own their kind of ideas. And obviously somebody like, and obviously most authors don't get paid very much at all, if anything. But you could, in theory, become J.K. Rowling. But because if your books are that successful, become incredibly rich. Whereas in the comic book world, at least in the past, you just couldn't become J.K. Rowling, no matter how successful. Even if you come up with Batman, who's way more famous than Harry Potter, you'll never be as rich as J.K. Rowling. And I kind of my question is then, how would you describe the situation now in the comic book industry? I know maybe you're not an expert, I don't know, but like as opposed to in the 90s or before the 90s, like how is that with do writers own their work, do artists own their work? What's the situation there? If you can give me any kind of insight into that.
A lot of it is the same. But if you're doing independent work, from my understanding, is you know, if you're working for Image, um, you know, you own the rights. But if you're working for the big two, you don't. Even
Okay.
if you create a character for Marvel, Marvel owns that character. Um, and Marvel's gotten a little bit better. You know, that Marvel being, as opposed to DC, they're the top dog, right? Like they're the movies that are making the
Yeah.
most money. There's the studio that's made the most movies. They now have like a special thanks in the credits, and they didn't used to do that, which is also crazy. But they have a special thanks, and there are more instances of actors, directors saying, "Oh, this is based off of this work," um, but it's still pretty bleak. DC,
Yeah.
on the other hand, especially with like James Gunn's new direction at the studio, um, who is like running the studio, from what I understand, is also a creative. Like he's also a director. I think he has a kind of understanding of this more than the Russo brothers do. Um, uh, he is like constantly being like, "Oh, this thing is based off of this book by
Yeah.
these artists," and um, Tom King, who's a writer, who I don't think is a very good writer. That's neither here nor there. Um, also worked for the CIA, like a crazy, interesting person that
Wow. Yeah.
people should look
Okay.
up with. um, uh, anyways, I should say I like some Tom King books. The Visions is a really good Tom King book, but I think the rest of his books are like kind of weird. Or they're just not as good as people say. Anyways, Tom King is like in the writers' room for a lot of these projects now, which is really interesting because that's not really the case. Like Brian K. Vaughan has like a toe in Hollywood. He did Saga. I don't know if you know, that's like a very famous Image book,
Oh
and
no,
he's
I
worked
saw it.
for the big two.
Okay.
Yeah, that's okay. Saga's great. You should check it out actually
Okay.
if you want to get back into comics. Great way to get into comics. Sorry, I'm jumping around, but
No,
yeah,
no, no, no.
there's like a little bit of there's a little bit of mobility now, like in and a little bit more recognition, but it's mostly on the writer side of things. It's still mostly the writers getting the recognition. Um, I just saw Supergirl, which is based off of a Tom King book. Um, and I'm falling into my own trap here because I forget who the name of the artist, and this is the issue. Um, but a lot of that movie is really influenced by the visuals of a particular Supergirl comic book. and the story, more so the story than the visuals, but definitely the visuals are present there. And everybody's talking about Tom King, and nobody's talking about this artist. And I think this
Yeah.
still, I imagine that maybe that artist is feeling like David sometimes, you
I'll
know.
find out. I'll find out the name of that artist and I'll
And
put it
I
on the
and
screen just so everybody knows.
yeah, thank you. Yeah, and an incredible artist, and like a way better artist than Tom King is a writer, I should say.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. No, that's interesting. It is. I think it's true. Like, yeah, I think about Watchmen, which again, like, I'm kind of exposing. It's kind of a guy who's only seen Boss Baby kind of thing to say. But when you think about Watchmen, it's like one of the most striking things about Watchmen is the
I love
coloring.
that. I love that analogy. Yeah.
And then like in the middle, right? And then they have this whole page, single page panels. And that's such a striking. That's kind of one of the best things about Watchmen is that kind of is the art, is is where the purples and the yellows and the greens rather than the kind of the reds and the blues. It kind of the coloring too. I don't even know who would be responsible for that. You said there's a color. I don't like, and it's just kind of it's a visual. That's kind of what sticks with me with that comic book more than the story even. So I do think like it is an injustice.
Yeah, I just looked it up to see. I was wondering if Dave Gibbons, who's the artist, if he does the colors too. But no, it's John Higgins is the colorist for that book.
I think that maybe it brings us to our final question that we ask all of our guests for this edition of Reading in the Culture, which is why write? And this is a very deliberately very open question, so please go in any direction you want to. Why do you write? Why should other people write? Why shouldn't people write? Why should people do this instead of writing? How should people like just go crazy with it? But essentially, why write?
Um, my One of my college professors, Manuel Gonzalez, who taught this class on a perfect vacuum. Um, in that class, he said, and I think he's borrowing this phrase from another writer, but he said, like writing is for nothing. There's no point in writing. There's no point in making art. Like art is just like it's useless, and that's why it's important. And like I think kind of from an anti-capitalist kind of perspective, which I know is a shared sentiment in reading into culture.
Yes, it is. It is. Yes.
I yeah. um, I feel as though like doing something that's not gonna make you money, especially like I mean I'm in New York City and I'm in the heart of there's the financial district is a couple minutes away from me. Like I'm in the heart of this like capitalistic framework all the time, and I run into people who are always talking. This is just America and the world. This is how like things are. Is that it's everybody knows this. I'm not breaking new ground, but but I think to do something in your free time, or as a profession that that has nothing to do with making money. I think it's really good for the soul. I think it's really good for your ego, and like, just reminding yourself that you're a human being. Which sounds, I'm sure, super cliche, but that is genuinely how I think about it. It's like if I don't write, I'm gonna go crazy. I'm gonna become
Yeah.
weirdo. I have to write.
No, I totally agree. I think that's a wonderful answer. I think writing is also it's an end in and of itself and not just a means to an end. It's kind of you're not doing it to make money or to really achieve anything. It's pointless, and because of that, there's a kind of I don't know. It is. There's no next step. You just write, and that's the beauty of it. Kind of existentially pure somehow. I don't know if that makes sense. But amazing. I think that's a really
Yeah.
wonderful answer. Okay, well then, I guess that brings us to the end of our episode for today. Thank you so much for being here, Liam. It's been a really wonderful chat. Thank you so much for giving us your time. I really don't take it for granted that people give us their time and their work like this. It means a lot to me. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much. This is a delight, and thank you for letting me ramble about comic books. I only get to do it like in front of my friends who tell me to shut up, and so it's great to just be able to talk about comics. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much. It was really interesting. It was really, really interesting. And yeah, I guess with that, I'll say thank you so much for watching. You can read Liam's piece Disaster More by readingintoculture.com/summer-2026. And you can read all of the other wonderful pieces from this edition and all the other editions, but also equally wonderful pieces. And if you like the podcast, please tell people about it, because it's people like it when you recommend them things often, especially good things like this podcast. So you should definitely tell people about it. And with that, I'll say bye, and we'll see you next week. Bye.